Well, welcome back. This video is called light harvesting, and it's about capturing as much detail and get as much out of your camera sensor as possible for the very best exposures. Now, our eyes can see a huge amount of detail in a scene, from the darkest shadows to the brightest highlights. Unfortunately, our cameras can't, and they need a bit of help sometimes. So this is all about how to approach various scenes and how to control the contrast in the scene and get the very best exposure from the camera. Now, sometimes you can resort to HDR and exposure blending, and I'll show you times when that is probably more appropriate. And we're also going to be using filters to help control the lighting in a scene. Now in the video we're going to refer to shooting RAW files, not JPEGs. The reason is RAW enables us to capture more information in the file, and means a little bit more work in post to get the information at the file as opposed to the camera applying the settings for us. So it just means more quality, and that's what this video ultimately is about, is capturing as much information at your files as possible. Now the scene behind me, this landscape, it's quite an overcast day today, but even so there's still a little bit of contrast depending on what your subject matter is. If it's a picture of a model in a field with a lovely grey sky with clouds, then the contrast automatically increases because you're trying to retain detail in the model's face and the eye sockets and hold detail in the clouds. So therefore this kind of low contrast looking landscape all of a sudden becomes quite a high contrast scene because you've added a model in. So, you know, flat lighting doesn't always mean low contrast. Now, back in the days of film, we didn't have the preview, the digital previews and the histograms on the back of the camera. Life was a little bit more difficult, should we say. So your best friend really was your light meter, and this is actually a incident meter, and it's also got a spot meter on it as well, which enables us to take very detailed readings of the scene from the sky and also from the ground or other parts of the scene, so you can work out how much contrast was in the scene. Obviously the meters in the cameras are very good, but when I was learning photography, I was always, one of the first things I learned was that obviously the light meter is very important, but the light meter is also a moron. Now, I didn't quite understand that to begin with, but what you've got to realise is the exposure meter is only as good as the person using it. When you point the camera's meter or a separate meter at a scene, it's presuming whatever you're pointing the meter at is grey, okay? So if I pointed the meter at the sky here today, which is fairly light grey but very light grey, it would basically expose it as if it was grey, so it'd be a lot darker, so we need to compensate for that. Likewise, if I exposed it at a dark object, it would probably very likely overexpose that because it's thinking it's grey and in fact it's black or dark, so you have to compensate again. So you need to consider that the meter's not only good as the person using it, so you need to take this into consideration. The general rule with light sensors is you want to flood as much light onto the sensor as possible without blowing important highlights. And that's the important bit, without blowing important highlights. Now again, each sensor is going to be different. I can normally guarantee I can overexpose my images by at least 2/3 or to a stop, and I can still bring that back because I shoot RAW in Photoshop. So we do that by adding as much light to the image as possible without blowing important highlights. Don't worry, I'm going to demonstrate that here and back in the studio for you. So what I've done here is I've taken a series of pictures of the landscape at calculated exposure, 1 stop over, 2 stops over, 2 stops under and 1 stop under. So I've breached my exposures just to show you when we get back to the studio the best exposure for this scene. It's not always what the camera tells you, because again it can be influenced by the sky, which is very bright here, so therefore if it latches onto that, if that's overwhelming the scene, maybe you're shooting low looking up, you're going to get maybe exposure for the sky there, it's going to darken the image too much. And again, like I said, if we want to retain as much detail in the scene as possible, we want to expose the image as much as possible, flood it the centre with as much light as possible without blurring important highlight details. If you wanted a silhouette, then that's not a problem. I would expose maybe more for the sky and just adjust it accordingly. But again, you can do that in post, and really you're better off again getting the best exposure you can and give yourself that flexibility, because maybe later on in post you decided that actually you don't really want a silhouette, you want to show a bit more detail, maybe in the grasses here, and obviously if you expose just for the sky, then you're going to limit yourself. So it's always better, even if you want to darken the image, to expose it as much as possible, get as much detail in there as possible into the file. Well, welcome back. We're now in Lightroom 5 and we've got the images that I shot in front of me. Before we proceed, let's just have a quick recap of what we're trying to achieve here, just to make sure we're on the same page. I'm just trying to show you how we can get the best data out of your camera by obviously putting the best exposure into it. Now, I'm not a technical person, but basically the way the sensors are made means that it's far better to slightly overexpose your images without clipping anything important than it is to underexpose. When we underexpose, there's less data at that end of the histogram to play around with. So when we start lightening stuff, we can quickly run into all sorts of artifacts and problems. However, if we overexpose slightly, and then we can always bring the exposure back, which is what I'm trying to show you here. Now, obviously, if you do overexpose, you are pretty much in trouble, because unlike film, where it would gradually fade out to white, with digital, and I'm sure you've experienced this, if you overexpose, it will clip to white almost immediately, and it gives a very nasty effect, and you cannot get that detail back. Once it's gone, it's gone. So it's a bit of a balance of act to overexpose, but knowing how much to overexpose, and that's only going to come by experimenting with your camera. Now, as I said in the video earlier, my camera, I can overexpose by 2/3 of a stop to a stop, maybe even a bit more depending on the scene. And this is where the histogram on your back of your camera, if you don't know how to read a histogram, I strongly advise that you go and onto PhotoTuts and find a suitable video that teaches you that, or I've done one, and I'm sure there's lots of written articles out there. You're far better using your histogram than the preview. The preview is not that much use, to be honest with you. It's okay to have a quick glance, or for poses and stuff like that, expressions, but for exposure data, the histogram is your best mate. So, in front of us, we've got our 5 images we shot. This is the calculated exposure that comes straight out the camera. This is 1 stop over, 2 stops over, 1 stop under, and 2 stops under. Now, what we need to look at here is the histogram. So let me just see if we can move this over to one side a minute to bring this over. So we can see from the histogram, this is the calculated exposure, and let me just bring this up a bit bigger, and you can see from the histogram we're actually not done a bad job. We haven't blown any highlights, because if it was blown, and we'll see in a minute from the overexposed ones, the data here would be off the chart here, would be clipped. And if it was underexposed, it would be clipped this side. As it is, it looks like the exposure is pretty good. So that's a very usable file, straight out of the camera at the calculated exposure. The next one is where I've overexposed the image by 1 stop, and you can see again our shadow details moved up to the right, but there's nothing clipped there, and our highlights are just starting to clip. Okay, just going off the scale here. The next image is the 2 stops over. You can see the shadows have shifted right over to the right hand side now. Again, that's not a problem. We can bring those back, but the highlights have very much clipped right off the scale. The 1 stop under, again, not too bad. We're clipping maybe a little bit, but nothing that probably we can't recover without too many problems. And then we go on to the 2 stops under, and you can see it is off the chart now here, clipping. So we know we've losing detail in this image. Not to say we can't bring it back a bit. The software these days is very good, but it's far better to do get it right in camera than it is to try and recover anything. So which would be my preferred exposure? Let's have a look at my little diagram. So here's a little diagram of my final choice. This is the overexposed by one stop image, and you can see the histogram here quite clearly on the page. And this is my final process version of that same image. And as you can see, the histogram shifted to the left. We've recovered that important highlight detail and brought some of that sky in there. So there's the original, and there's my final image. So I'm just going to take you over to Lightroom now and just show you how I recovered that. So here's our image, the overexposed by one stop image. First of all, I'll start by hitting auto on the image there, which sets my black and white points. And then going to grab the highlights, holding down the Alt Option key. That shows you where the highlights are clipping. I'm just going to bring that back. And I'm also going to grab the white slider and bring that back. And you see the histogram now. If you look in the top corner, the histogram is moving across to show that I'm recovering some highlight detail. And then it's just a matter of adjusting the blacks a bit further to bring some of that detail and contrast into the image, like so. You can see we've got that highlight detail there in the sky. So is there a big difference between this and what I could have produced from the normal image? Probably not huge, but I know that I've got the most of the data from the sensor by choosing the overexposed by one stop image, and that's a good habit to get into in my opinion, especially when you start to get into slightly more tricky images. So it's knowing how much data you can recover. Let's just have a quick look before we move on. This is the overexposed by two stops image, and let's see how much we can recover from this one. Here's my highlight slider, hold down the Alt key, and again we've pulled out quite a bit of detail from there. It's not clipping now, but it is still quite like very white. So I'm just going to pull the white slider back now. The difference is here, I think you can start to see we have pulled back detail, but it's detail that's not there. It's clipped too far, and this is going very blocky now and posturized. So this one, on the face of it, looked like we managed to pull it out of the bag, but in fact all we've pulled out is lots of noise and various other problems in this one. So yeah, that was a step too far. But this one, absolutely fine, and even my normal exposure on this one was quite usable, but we definitely got the most out of the sensor by choosing the overexposed one, which is one stop overexposed. So how much you overexpose will be a bit of a test. You'll have to obviously go out and test that depending on your cameras. No set rules. In the next bit of the video, I'm going to show you, we're going to place a model, in inverted commas, a model into the scene, and I'm going to show you how we can just add a little bit of extra lighting into the scene to reduce the contrast. I've also done a picture. I've put myself in frame, unfortunately. No good looking models today, just me. So I put myself in frame and done a picture with me, and then I've added good old flash, and I've adjusted to show you how filling flash can help. Even on a day like today, as I said, that's fairly overcast, there's still quite a lot of dark patches going on in the eye sockets, and yeah, you can try and pull that out in one exposure in Photoshop, but it's never very natural, very successful. So you're far better getting a reflector, which sometimes can be a bit of a pain to use, especially in dull light. They don't work that well if you get really close. Or just a bit of a fill-in flash, and that's my preferred method. With a bit of fill-in flash, you can work, especially if I'm on my own working, which sometimes I am, then a fill-in flash is great, because I don't need anybody to hold the reflector for me. And you know, we're only on about popping in a little bit of flash just to add a few catch lights to the eyes and just lighten the scene again. In Lightroom, here's the 4 images I shot with myself doing the modelling. Less said about that, the better, I think. So we've got our first exposure here, which is completely daylight, no fill-in, and as you can see, you know, it's not blocked up completely, but the histogram is clipping, and these eye sockets are going quite dark. The next exposure is with flash on, so this is just trying to balance the flash directly with the daylight, which is very much a bit too harsh for what I'd like for this particular image anyway. The third one is a stop under, so it's just a bit of fill-in flash, and then we've gone 2 stops under, which gives a much more natural effect. It's just enough to lift the eye sockets, but keep the ambient light as the main light. So it's just really very, very subtle effect. So that's the way to go. And again, it's just lifted the eye sockets just enough that they're not blocking up. Here's our one without the flash, and our image with a fill-in, and you can see there's some nice catch lights in the eyes there, like so. So that's a good way of reducing contrast in our images and allowing us to get a good exposure. If I didn't do that, I would have to go into this image and start lightening the image. And when I start lighting an image, I'm going to be doing that globally. That means the background's also going to get lightened, and we're going to lose detail in the sky, unless I obviously mask the image off, which again, a little bit more work, and maybe you haven't got time for that. Also, depending on how dark and how much you've got to lighten, we're also then going to get problems with posterization and noise, etc. Also in the image, hence, we're going to degrade the quality of the picture eventually. But it is possible, but depending on how much you've got to do, far better to do it in camera and add a little bit of fill-in flash. Obviously, there's graduated filters also we've got discussed yet. This wouldn't be usable for a graduated filter shot because obviously you've got my bonds in the foreground here, and obviously the graduated filter would have to come down over the sky here, and that would darken my head as well, so that wouldn't be an ideal solution. So adding supplementary lighting in this case is the best solution. Now, we might not need it today, but if we've got a scene where there's lots of bright lights, and normally it's in the sky, maybe towards sunset, and you want to hold detail in the shadows, i.e. the grass and the sky, your camera's not going to cope with that. And if you don't want to go into HDR and do all that business, which is another option, well, again, we'll look at reasons why you might want to use that for some images later on in the studio. You can use one of these, which I'm sure you've seen. It's a graduated filter. This one's made by High-Tech. Lee also makes some very good quality ones, and there's other companies like Kokin, etc. They do vary in quality and price. These ones are quite expensive, but obviously I need the best quality I can. And these just simply put over the lens, like so, and it darkens the top of the image. See that's going on. This is the 3-stop one. They come in various densities. I'm sure you've seen all these before. The advantage of these are that you haven't got to worry about doing a lot of post-processing work, or maybe stripping in the sky, or blending 2 pictures, or doing HDR. As I said, it's done at the time of capture, and that can be quite useful sometimes. The disadvantage was sometimes you'll have in scene, maybe there's trees in the scene, or maybe there's buildings, and as I said, this is going to darken the whole sky, including the top of those buildings or trees. Sometimes you might not want that. So in that case, you obviously may have to resort to other methods. So graduated filters, very good, well worth having a couple in your camera bag if you can afford them. Buy the best ones you can afford, because again, anything you put in front of the lens is going to degrade the quality of the image. So good quality ones are not cheap, but they're well worth the investment. Okay, so we've looked at several solutions for getting the very best data out of your camera in terms of the exposure, and also for in-camera reducing the contrast of the scene so that you don't have to fiddle around with the file too much in post. But what happens if you come to a scene like this? You've got a very dark interior and a very, very bright exterior. Well, a graduated filter isn't going to cut it on this image because obviously the window is that the light is coming through the entrance here, or it could be a window. Supplementary lighting, well, possibly on some interiors. Certainly, you could use if you know how, and are quite creative and know how to set your lights up to make the image look interesting and creative. Is a possibility. On this particular image, you'd need a lot of power, so that's very unlikely. So what does that leave us? Well, that leaves us only real one other option, and that is to do something in post. And as I said, most of the things I've showed you today are all done in camera. But we could use a couple of options. You could do a HDR. Now, this is some stills from a video I did on HDR for Photosets a while back, and it shows you how to do sort of natural HDR exposure blending type images. And the other option is maybe to take an interior picture like this one and an exterior picture, and then maybe strip those two images together. And that is a distinct possibility, especially with Windows and stuff. That is where a lot of people do them. Maybe even a double exposure. Some cameras allow you to do double exposures, but let's say you're going to do it in post. Obviously, in Photoshop, you've got that a little bit more flexibility. Here's the final image I did here, which is done in Photomatics HDR, more of a natural finished image, rather than some funky, very kind of grungy look, which is quite more known for HDR, I think. So that's probably the best option for this type of images. If you've got an interior of a church or a house, a restaurant, hotel, and you've got those extremes of lighting and you can't use a graduated filter or supplementary lighting, then really some kind of exposure blending and post-production is really the only viable option of combining those pictures. And the good thing about that is you can optimize each of the images for the best exposure. So you get the best exposure you can for the interior and the best exposure available for the exterior, and then you can blend those together to produce one final image with extremely good results. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you've enjoyed it and you've learnt a few useful bits of information from it, and hopefully I will catch you on the next episode. Cheers for watching.